Hi, everybody. My name is Andrew Shikyar. I'm the Executive Director and Chief Marketing Officer at Fido Alliance. I'm very pleased to be here today for this Fido technical seminar in Korea. You know, Korea has a very rich history of innovation and technology across sectors, across time, but especially of late with Fido authentication. We're very grateful for all the contributions from Fido members in Korea, and in particular, the leadership of the Fido Korea Working Group, which is chaired by Dr. Shin from Samsung and co-chaired by Dr. Oh of TrustKey. I'd also like to thank our senior advisor, Dr. Yoon, who has been so gracious with his time and expertise in engaging with Fido Alliance and our members. I used to travel to Korea to give this sort of presentation, but considering our current circumstance, I'm happy just to be able to present remotely on the latest updates from Fido Alliance. So what you see here are a bunch of statistics, and frankly, we could spend the entirety of today with similar data points talking about all of the damages and challenges that passwords have thrust upon the industry. Passwords are not only difficult to use and inconvenient for users, but ultimately, perhaps most importantly, they present a clear and ongoing risk and threat to businesses around the globe. The fact of the matter is the vast majority of data breaches are due to weak credentials, and the only way to stop that problem is to stop our dependency on knowledge-based credentials themselves. So here we are in 2022, and we're halfway through the year, and I have some predictions as we move forward this year and into next year. The first prediction, unfortunately, is that phishing attacks will continue to succeed. Phishing is the most popular form of remote attacks, simply because they're relatively cheap to execute and they have a staggering success rate. A well-designed phishing attack will be successful over 40% of the time, meaning that someone doesn't just open the email, they'll also be successfully phished. But that's not really new. In fact, I could make the same prediction about phishing attacks for the past several years, and I would have been 100% correct, because phishing, again, continues to be a very popular and successful attack vector. But really, my headline prediction, and something we're seeing more and more, is that multi-factor authentication bypass attacks will become mainstream. And by that, I'm talking about SMS, OTP hijacking, and things like that, where a man in the middle or machine in the middle hijacks the supposedly secure 2FA process to still take over the account. And we've seen some very high-profile examples of this over the past several months in the crypto space and gaming, OCBC Bank in Singapore, the list goes on. And the fact of the matter is, too many people are looking at legacy forms of two-factor authentication as good enough to protect secure assets, and ultimately, we need to do better. So let me give you some happier predictions for the years to come. First of all, passwordless deployments in the enterprise will grow rapidly. We're seeing more and more companies leveraging the built-in Fido capabilities in leading platforms and devices to allow their employees to be less dependent on passwords, which also shuts down a major threat vector from hackers. Additionally, mobile platforms will begin to provide consumer-ready solutions at scale. And so not only, as you see in this diagram, are leading firms like Gartner saying that now is the time to implement passwordless authentication, the device manufacturers and leading platforms are also building this into their devices, which will allow consumers to follow suit with passwordless implementations. Ultimately, what we know needs to happen is a fundamental shift in the way that we authenticate users to systems. And we need to move from kind of the legacy way we've been doing things, which is largely knowledge-based credentialing, to a more modern approach, which is more possession-based, right? And so just to clarify what I mean, knowledge-based credentials, of course, are things that you know, things that are in your head, things you remember. So a so-called shared secret, like a password, which is stored in a server, SMS OTP, using knowledge-based authentication for onboarding or proofing, passwords, things like that. The more modern form of authentication typically is something in your hand, right? Using a biometric in your device where you're authenticating locally to that device. The device then actually handles the cryptographic communication to allow you to securely access resources. So that includes things like local biometrics, PINs, using possession-based document authentication for onboarding, and the new concept passkeys, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. Ultimately, the old way of authenticating is highly susceptible to common threats, whereas a modern form of authentication is phishing resistant and immune from the scalable remote attacks. Ultimately, modern authentication needs to be user-initiated and cryptographically secure, which takes the human element and the human mistakes that we're all prone to make out of the equation to allow for more secure user authentication. And of course, that's been Fido's imperative since day one. Fido's tagline is simpler, stronger authentication, and that's been our goal, as you see in this diagram. Something more usable and more secure than both passwords as well as traditional means of multi-factor authentication. I already talked about the fact that SMS OTP, as we all know, is not highly secure, and it's also not very usable. But usability is very important, right? So what Fido's doing is providing user-friendly asymmetric public key cryptography. The average user shouldn't have to know what that means, let alone say it, to leverage it. That's our core belief. And Fido didn't invent asymmetric public key cryptography, but the unique thing about Fido authentication is that it's user-friendly. There's a dustbin full of highly secure technologies that were too difficult to use to scale to mainstream use. And so we really need to find that right balance between usability and security for any modern authentication solution, any multi-factor authentication solution to take root and be adopted at scale. As you may know, we're an industry body of over 250 companies worldwide. These logos represent our board of directors. It's certainly a very impressive list of companies, including several from throughout Asia Pacific. But what I think is most important about these companies is that it's really the right set of companies that we need to have sitting around the table to solve the password problem, right? So we have companies who provide the platforms and devices that are shipping at massive scale that are in our fingertips every day. We have leaders in biometrics, security, and identity who bring all sorts of expertise to the table. And then last but not least, we have these service providers whose businesses are utterly dependent on their ability to securely deliver high assurance services to billions of users worldwide. So these are the merchants, the e-commerce providers, the payment networks and such. It's really this combination of companies that bring requirements into the alliance that are then built into technical specifications and best practices that companies are starting to adopt at massive scale. The rest of our membership, reflects this blend of companies. In addition to our board members you see here, we have sponsor members who really build out our technical and adoption working groups. We have associate members who by and large comprise the Fido certified ecosystem. We liaise with other .orgs and nonprofits to address adjacent and regional use cases. And we also have government members who help inform the membership and our technical specifications on relevant regulatory policy and best practices. So very briefly, I want to give a recap on how Fido authentication works. Several of you may know this, but for those of you who are newer, I just want to give the high-level overview of Fido authentication. What you see here is the way that we've historically logged on to services. There's a user at her desk, and there's a server that the user wants to have access to, and you need to present a password or a knowledge-based credential to authenticate. What Fido has done is introduce a concept called the Authenticator, right? The Authenticator essentially mediates the authentication process. Instead of logging in directly to the server, the Authenticator will now manage that for us. And this is where public key cryptography comes into play. Instead of a password on a server and the secret in the head, we have a public key on the server, and then the private key, the corresponding private key, is stored securely in the Authenticator on the user's device. The user must verify herself to that device in order to in order for the private key to be used. That verification is always a local method. So whether it's a biometric or a PIN or a security key, it's always local to that device. And once that verification has taken place, the authentication ceremony can happen, right? There's a challenge response dialogue between the public key and the private key, between the authenticator and the server. That's what allows the user to be authenticated securely to the website. What this does is it takes out the threat of a remote attacker. So whereas in the old model, there is this big blank space between the user and the server for the hackers pretend to be a legitimate site. Now the authenticator actually mediates that process. And the communication between the authenticator and the server, between the key pair, is cryptographically secure with added data in there that needs to match precisely in order for the authentication to take place. And your remote attacker can't spoof that, as they either don't have the public key or the private key. Therefore, the whole remote attack breaks down entirely when it comes time to authenticate. So that's how it works at a high level. That's been our mission since day one, and that's been reflected in Phyto specifications. One thing we realized, a long time ago is that in order to achieve, adoption of Phyto authentication, we need to have endpoint ubiquity, right? So Phyto needs to be built into every part of our daily lives. And we've achieved that by seeing very strong browser and operating system support. So literally every device being unboxed right now, the vast majority of devices being unboxed this very second have support for Phyto authentication. It's supported in every leading Android, Apple, and Windows device, also in all leading web browsers, including the Samsung Internet Web Browser, which gives us, very wide distribution, very broad capabilities, so that a service provider can deploy Phyto with confidence in knowing that its users can actually leverage Phyto authentication. And so it's little wonder then that we've seen strong market validation and strong market adoption. This is a very small sampling of companies that support Phyto authentication, but ultimately we're seeing Phyto adopted across borders, across sectors, across use cases. And so we've been very happy with the initial adoption we've seen to date, which literally is being leveraged by hundreds of millions of users worldwide. Now, that being said, our mission is far from complete, right? Why isn't everyone using Phyto all the time? One thing we've realized is that usability comes into play, right? So even though Phyto and WebAuthn supported on all the leading browsers, there are some usability challenges, frankly, that vary between browsers and operating systems and device types that a lot of service providers are concerned about and are holding them back from deploying at scale. So to reach mass adoption, we need to further usability while keeping security top of mind and in clear focus. So let's talk about some usability initiatives that Fido Alliance has launched over the past year. First of all, last year, we implemented our first Fido user experience guidelines. This is for the platform authenticator use case, basically guiding service providers on how to most effectively leverage built-in biometrics on desktop computers or laptops. So your MacBook, your Windows laptop, they both have biometric capabilities. These guidelines tell people how to deploy most successfully. This year, we launched a user experience committee. This is a very important task force that we have inside of Fido Alliance. Unlike every other working group inside of Fido, these are not technical standards people taking part in this committee. The UX committee is comprised of designers and usability leads from some of the largest brands on the planet. They're giving guidance and will have purview over everything that Fido puts out to make sure that usability is reflected in all of our outputs. This year, we will be implementing our next set of UX guidelines focused on security key implementations, which is very important, especially in the enterprise as companies deploy more and more FIDO2 security keys. And then last but not least, usability is also reflected in the latest innovation from Fido and its partners called multi-device Fido credentials, also known as passkeys. So let's talk a few minutes about what passkey means and what it is. And ultimately, Fido Alliance has always had a recovery challenge. Possession-based authentication is wonderful in the sense that it's highly secure unphishable, and immune from remote attacks. But the question's always lingered, what happens if I lose possession of my possession-based authenticator? That's a fair question. And frankly, most companies have defaulted to re-enrolling users or using knowledge-based credentials to help them recover their accounts. But the same approach also pertains to Phyto authentication in general, so long as you need to have one private key enrolled for each device. So even if I've enrolled for travelprovider.com on one PC, if I go to my next PC, I also need to enroll there, which requires me to maintain my knowledge-based credential. It also requires the travelprovider.com to make that available to me. And so it's both a usability challenge and a security challenge. So what we're aiming to do is get rid of that through this easier approach of Phyto, more user-friendly approach for deploying Phyto authentication. So passkeys, as they're called, enables deployment of Phyto at scale to consumers moving between devices and upgrading to new ones. Ultimately, what this does is it syncs the private key across the device cloud securely, so that if I am enrolled, again, in that scenario, from one PC and I go to another one, I'll automatically be recognized, and all I need to provide to securely sign in is my local device sign-in. So typically a biometric or a PIN or whatever I'm doing to unlock that device. No longer do I need to re-enroll that next device. No longer does the service provider need to maintain that password on their server to allow me to recover that device. So in that sense, this concept of multi-device Phyto credentials, addresses both usability and security, and the challenges associated with account recovery. There's two key things here that are enabled by this concept. The first one is that, again, it allows users to automatically access their credentials on all their devices without having to enroll for every account. We've already talked about that. The other use case that this enables is for someone to actually use Phyto on their mobile device to sign in to an app or website on a nearby device to go across platforms. Right. So going back to that scenario, so say hypothetically I've started on my iPhone or my Android phone. Say I started on my Galaxy phone, and I'm on the that cloud, and then I go to log into my PC. So while passkey is specific to a device cloud, I can go across clouds through this local login. So in this scenario, when I'm going to log in with my PC, I simply take my Galaxy phone to a very close, connection to my device and establish a seamless Bluetooth pairing that allows me to leverage that Galaxy biometric to sign into my PC. After that time, the service provider can allow me to just leverage biometric on my PC for subsequent logins. So in that case, I'll then move from the Galaxy/Android cloud to the PC cloud to allow me to log in there and onwards without ever entering a password. So that's kind of the way we bootstrap across clouds in a very seamless, password-free manner. One thing that's very important to note is that all three platform providers, the major device operating system platform providers in Apple, Google, and Microsoft, have all committed to support this capability in their devices in the year to come. So ultimately, this passkey concept expands, the ways that one can deploy Phyto authentication. And a very important point to consider is that every company, every organization has their own axes, their own dependencies and considerations and challenges in deploying Phyto authentication. So whether your axes are regulatory challenge and device types, or maybe it's the number of users that you have, or different geographies that you're scaling across, Phyto authentication can scale across those requirements. So from very small and localized implementations to very broad and diverse and regulated implementations, the Phyto specifications can scale to all of them. So with that, thank you very much for your time today. I hope you learn more from the rest of the sessions in today's seminar, in today's conference, and I look forward to seeing you at a future Phyto event. Thank you.